Frankie Fraser's been in prison for more than 42 years, certified insane 3 times, and was even declared the most dangerous man in Britain.
You used any weapon, whatever you could get hold of, a gun, a knife, a hammer, bar of iron, whatever. That's how it was then.
He's kind of the little big man of British crime.
Big fellas were frightened of him because they knew he'd come behind you and stab you, and you wouldn't know anything about it. I mean, he didn't care.
They're the rules and you've got to abide by them. Once you sign up, that's it. You sign up for the rest of your life.
Frankie has lived through the most notorious battles of the British underworld, from the Sabini Gang to the Billy Hill era, to the Krays and the Richardsons. In that time, he's earned his infamous nickname, Mad Frankie Fraser.
Crime is the only profession where it's an advantage to be regarded as mad. You never knew if they were suddenly going to up and whack you or stab you or whatever.
Frankie's getting on a bit now and wants to tell his story one last time. During the making of this documentary, his health took a turn for the worse, but something like a few hospital visits wasn't going to stop him.
Frankie Fraser's last stand. That's when I went like that to the judge.
A famous Londoner, Frankie was born in 1923 and grew up just round the corner from Waterloo Station.
Round Waterloo at the time was really, really slums. A poor area. I mean, there would be a lot of rats. There were factories there. It really was a hard life.
My father was the most honest man I've ever come across. He was born in Canada and his mother was a Red Indian. And he was in like the Merchant Navy, American Navy, and in the First World War, come over on a convoy, met Mum. They fell in love and got married and that, and I was the youngest of 5 of us. I was the baby of the family.
The Frasers were good Catholics, and Frankie went to the local school, St. Patrick's. At one point, he was even captain of the football team. The sports-mad boy was always closest to his sister Eva.
Eva was really Frank's, I was going to say, twin in a way. She was much nearer to him in age. She had the same dark hair, aquiline profile, and they got up to all sorts of scrapes together.
I don't know how true it is with the Cherokee Indian or the Indian, but certainly if you saw Eva, you could see almost like a squaw, the hair. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And you see Frank, you know, with his nose, and you think, oh yeah. A totem pole.
Not only my wonderful sister, my best pal. She was terrific. You couldn't have a better sister, yeah. You name it, we nicked it.
They were not averse, I think, to doing a bit of pickpocketing, a bit of theft here. One of the things was the old trick, I think it was called the Murphy game. Someone would say, could you carry my suitcase? And he would give you some money, and that would be the last he saw of the suitcase.
When Frankie was 9 years old, his criminal potential was talent spotted by a well-known London gang, the Sabinis.
They were the racecourse protection racketeers of the end of the First World War through the 20s, through the 30s. And they were the big London villains.
At the races, I'd be bucket boy and things like that, which was all handy, you know.
The way it worked was the bookmakers who had the money would have to pay somebody officially to have their blackboards wiped with the odds changing, and a boy would go around with a bucket and a sponge and do it for them. Completely unnecessary. The bookies could have done it themselves, but they would pay whatever, half a crown or something like that. And that meant that they didn't get bothered. If they didn't pay the money, then a gang of people, and they often worked in gangs, would knock over their board, take their money and harass them.
The gang was made up of 6 brothers and was led by Charles Sabini, nicknamed Derby.
Well, Well, he looked like a proper Italian, as you imagine one would look like, and he was one terrific fella, without a doubt.
Darby Sabini would be well known. I mean, at that stage, this is before criminals had a kind of glamour attached to them, but they would be well known within the criminal underworld, and therefore to be adopted, as it were, by the Sabinis and reckoned as a tough little fellow would have been quite a sort of career accomplishment for Frank, and I think that was his first step up the criminal ladder.
And it wasn't just young Frankie who was making a name for himself. His sister Eva was making her mark too.
It was before my time, but she was part of what was called the 40 Thieves, which had been running for years and years, probably since about 1900. Top women shoplifters. To be invited, actually, to join the 40 Thieves was something of an honour. And they were women only. Men were used only as a supporting cast. They were the chauffeurs and carried some of the goods out to the back of the car. She was well regarded.
They were a group of women, but they were very classy, what they call hoisters, and they went to all the West End, and you know, it wasn't just a case of nicking something out of the local shop. They targeted certain things. Whether it be fur coats or whatever. And Frank was thrilled, which was, you know, hilarious to me. I mean, it was, he just thought, he was so proud of her.
She done it in style, Eva, yeah. She was very good. She wasn't some petty little tuppeny-halfpenny oyster. She done it in good style, yeah. And as I was growing up, whenever I had to buy a shirt, Eva made sure she nicked them for me.
As Frankie hit his teens, he became too old to work as a bucket boy for the Sabinis. He started branching out on his own. It wasn't long before the law caught up with him for the first time.
That was for petty offence, really. Stealing something out of a shop. Cigarettes, when I've never ever smoked.
Like many wayward boys of his time, Frankie was sent to an approved school.
All schools that you ordinarily went to were very strict then. So the reform school was much stricter. And they'd give you the cane much more frequently. Of course, I kept escaping. It wasn't for me. I wanted me freedom.
No London approved school could keep him under control. He kept escaping to commit further petty crimes. So Frankie was finally sent to Arndale approved school in Essex.
First time he chinned a screw in a postal. And once he chinned that screw, the Home Secretary then could change a postal to 3 years penal servitude. And once he got there into a prison, well, straight away when they looked at his records, it was this little bastard.
And got in so much trouble in Borstal, at the Birch, that the Home Secretary of the day had the power to convert your Borstal into 3 years penal servitude. And that's what he done. And I was immediately transferred from Borstal to prison. And I done every day.
What he always used to say was that the problem was none of the family had been in prison and he didn't know what to do. And he always says if he'd had Uncle Jim, who had done a couple of years, and would say to him, look, Frank, keep your head down, don't cause trouble, he might have listened to him, but there was no one for him to talk to. And he said that once he'd had a couple of fights with warders and so on, he was a marked man.
There's such a pride in it. And also, if you've got that inside you where you want, no, I won't be bullied by them, you'd fight back.
Frankie was without a doubt violent when he was young. I don't know if he had an uncontrollable temper, but he had a temper, and he was very, very tough. And you really had to knock him out to keep him down. It was, he was a very nasty opponent. And I don't suppose he played by the rules either.
You can see how small I am. Imagine then I was about as fat as that. And they'd think, look at the little cockney so-and-so, we'll put him in his place. And I'd fight them back. Simple as that.
This is the story of Mad Frankie Fraser, one of Britain's most notorious gangsters, who's been convicted for 26 separate offences and spent more than 42 years inside. And prison is where Frankie found himself for the first 3 years of the Second World War, helping him to avoid conscription. But by the end of 1942, that changed when he was given a medical for the army and deemed fit for service.
I'd only been home about a week and my papers come to go in the army. Mum said, "Oh, look." I said, "Put them on the fire." I slung them on the fire. I never answered it, did I? I was the best deserter the army ever had.
So far as his military career is concerned, it's not exactly shining. He deserted whenever he could, he avoided it whenever he could, and he eventually was invalided out.
The sheer discipline of the army, I just wouldn't have been able to handle it. I couldn't handle it in prison, yet alone in the army.
This is how he got his nickname. He pretended to be mad, and he had a number of different examinations in hospital. I think in those days they had techniques that they thought they could examine people's brain waves to see whether or not they were mad or not. And I think Frank thought some dreadful thoughts about "I'll kill the general" or something like that, and he reckoned that must have classified him as mad. So as a result of that, he then became known as Mad Frank Fraser, and that has been with him, for the rest of his life.
The chaos of war provided plenty of opportunities for the mad young criminal.
Frank always thought that the war years were the years that made everybody into criminals, and it's possibly he's right.
Everyone then was into crime, even the most honest people. You wanted to win the war, but you wanted it to go on forever, because it was a thief paradise. God blimey. Whatever you nicked you could sell. They would not only sell, they'd be queuing up to buy it off you.
Nobody seemed to take any notice of you, really. I mean, anyone bombed out couldn't really know what they had left in the shop, so you used to go in and take whatever you wanted to take.
You never robbed homes, things like that, no way. But if a jeweller's, got bombed, you couldn't break into it quick enough and help it out by nicking everything.
Frank, along with a lot of other members of the criminal fraternity, profited from that change of culture.
It was during the war years that Frankie became friends with one of the biggest gangsters of the day.
Well, Billy Hill was the boss of all bosses. And in 1942, when I met him in Chelmsford prison, he was terrific, yeah.
They shared the same birthday, which is, my dad always remarks on. December the 13th. He said that made sort of a bond between them.
And Bill could see a good man of worth, and he put the old man to work a few times, and they become very friendly.
Frank has aligned himself with Billy Hill, and that's how he gets up a few steps in the criminal hierarchy.
The war had ended. Frankie, as always, was in and out of prison for a number of offences, including a smash and grab on a jeweller's.
Their plans then was all about getting some more money. As simple as that.
Because it's all about money, isn't it?
Yes. Thank God for that.
Oh, money's part of it, it's obvious. You can't tell me someone would do something just out of soul thrill of it. I mean, I'd rob a bank for money, but it was the thrill of getting the money. You walk out with 100 grand, you think, oh, you've had it off.
Originally, it was about money for him. It's always about money for people like us. It's not just about prestige, it's money. Money is the ultimate goal if you're at it, if you're a thief, it's money.
In 1949, Billy Hill was released from prison, and 25-year-old Frankie acted as muscle for the Soho Gangster.
He would be the enforcer. Hill would be the brains, Frank would do the work.
He had a reputation for being a violent man and for being fearless, and therefore could take part in a robbery or extracting money from people who were getting protection.
Hill also paid by the stitch, so if you put 50 stitches in a man's face, you could expect £50. And apparently people looked in the newspapers, the evening newspapers, to see the next day how many stitches had been put in their victim's face and how much they were due to be paid. Fraser would be one of those people who would use a razor.
It was a job you was doing. You know, you was involved in either villainy or going to cut somebody for somebody. It was a job. You was getting paid to do it.
The difference between professional criminals in this country and in the United States is the gun. I mean, the gun was never a big feature in this country certainly until after the war. People used koshes or fists or razors or knives, but they didn't use a gun. And anyone who wanted to be involved in criminality had to be handy with their fists, and I think that was a given.
For every London gangster, Soho in the West End was the place to be.
It was very much the magnet that attracted young criminals, people who wanted fun, and that, you know, and there was prostitution, there was strip clubs and things like that. And so that was where the money was, and that was where people who could turn a blind eye to criminality would go, and that's where a lot of the bent police were.
That's where the real money was, yeah. So everyone was fighting to be in control of the West End, the jewel in the crown.
And everybody wanted a piece of the action. Billy Hill worked with protection specialist Jack Spot to take over Soho from the powerful White family.
When Billy Hill came out of prison, there almost at the gates was Spot to meet him, and Spot was the senior partner, as it were, initially. But Billy Hill was far, far smarter than Spot ever was. But between them, they got rid of the Whites. Hill and Spot ran the West End with a benevolent dictatorship. They took money off what was called the smudge, which were fake photographs being taken of tourists in Trafalgar Square. They ran the peanut selling rackets. So, you know, in those days you used to sell sixpence worth of peanuts to tourists to feed the pigeons. They used to run that. They ran everything.
In May 1952, Billy Hill allegedly pulled off the biggest heist of the time, the East Castle robbery. He and his team stole over £200,000 from a post office van.
Billy Hill was never convicted of it, and it was a famous robbery, and it gave him an enormous amount of kudos. And he would kind of joke about it. So he was the kind of top man in London, or certainly in Soho and the West End at the time.
Spot is now desperately jealous. Coupled and added to that, the Italians, what's left of the Sabinis, are now thinking they want the point-to-point racing back. And by 1955, there are serious ructions between Spot and Hill.
Meanwhile, Frankie had been serving a sentence in Broadmoor, the hospital for the criminally insane. And in the summer of 1955, he was released. He went to work again for Billy Hill. It wasn't long before Jack Spot attacked one of their close associates, Albert Dimes. It was decided there must be consequences, and revenge was planned. On the 2nd of May, 1956, Spot was violently attacked.
Hill determines that Spot has to be dealt with one way or the other, and that is when he recruits or asks Frank to go and deal with Spot. And Spot is slashed to bits.
Billy Hill and that made a decision, and then you just obeyed that decision. Spot had to be done. Of course, he was done.
Jack Spot reported the attack to the police. Frankie was arrested, something Frankie and Billy Hill never thought would happen.
Grassing was, you know, the 11th deadly sin, thou shalt not grass. And a lot of criminals stuck to that, even although they hated the people who had cut them and beaten up.
Well, he's just a rat, isn't he?
Oh, just a rat.
Just a rat. The old man said to me, he said, well, that's when they decided he's got to go. He said, but we heard what he said today. No way in the world did we ever dream he will get in there. Swear my father's life away, who was guilty, but innocent men as well. So he turned out.
Rat.
Billy will never ever dreamt that Spot would nick us going to the police, no. He didn't like him, but he didn't think he'd be that wicked. Because in our world, to go to the police and say someone hit you with an hammer or something, that wasn't allowed. You never done that.
To the old school criminal, a grass was the most despicable of creatures. In fact, under what was known as Rule 43, grasses, nonces, sex offenders, paedophiles, and bent policemen were kept separate from other prisoners in prison because they knew that they would be attacked.
You know that's only one thing you do. Just one thing only. You keep that shut and say what you want to say when you got to say it, but not before.
Frankie was found guilty of maliciously wounding Jack Spot with the intent to cause grievous bodily harm and sentenced to 7 more years inside prison. But that didn't stop Mad Frankie. This is the story of Mad Frankie Fraser, the villain who has lived through the most infamous periods in British gangland history, with a deadly reputation. By the early 60s, his status had grown in the criminal world, after serving 7 years inside prison for the attack on Jack Spot. So much so that up-and-coming East End gangsters, the Kray twins, made moves to recruit him before his release in 1962.
They were building their own reputation for essentially protection rackets, running clubs, and they wanted somebody like Frank Fraser attached to them so that people would be more fearful of not paying them or messing around with them.
Across the river, 2 more brothers were making their own reputation. The Richardsons, from Camberwell in South London.
Eva has married into a South London family, and Frank aligns with himself with his sister. It's also right that a member of that family took a bad beating while Frank was away, and the Richardsons went and sorted it out on Eva's or on the man's behalf. And Frank now feels he really ought to be with the Richardsons.
I think Frank probably had quite a reputation. He was a bit of a lad, you could say, in those days. Quite fiery. I think Charlie probably admired that in him.
So, it was decided. Frankie had aligned himself with the South Londoners, the Richardsons.
In South London, you never trusted anyone from East London. They were like 2 different towns in a way. You never forget them things.
I think for them it was a bit of a coup. There's a suggestion, somebody said that Frank Fraser joining the Richardsons was like China getting the atom bomb.
The swinging 60s meant profitable times for the London underworld.
I think at that time that what we call the criminal underworld was quite a small world. It was a time when I think there were probably the numbers of people in prison in the 50s was about 10,000. Now it's about 80,000. So it was a much smaller circle of people involved in crime. And the police, when there was a big robbery or something like that, it would be a case of rounding up the usual suspects, and quite often they would be right.
It was all families. Families must know other families, otherwise you don't go to work with them. That's the golden rule.
What's quite interesting about that period is the criminal world and gangland in many ways reflects what's happened to British business. At that time it was all family firms, the Whites and then later the Krays and the Richardsons and the Arifs and the Adams and so on, and now it's all multinationals.
Frankie formed a specific alliance with Richardson brother Eddie. In March 1964, they set up a company called Atlantic Machines.
come out of prison with a terrific name, got into the one-armed bandits, which were like a little gold mine in days.
It was the time of fruit machines and slot machines, and a lot of them being allowed to be used in clubs and bars and pubs in the West End, and they were very lucrative. And so they would supply these machines to clubs, and there would also be a fee, I think, that went with it, that your machines would be protected if you were signed up with Eddie Richardson and his team.
I had a club, the Senate Rooms. Eddie and Charlie and Frank, they put this music machine in my club. And what they'd done, every 2 or 3 months they'd come and empty the machine, give me a third, and they took 2/3, which was fair enough. I mean, it wasn't costing me nothing. And I was quite pleased with that. But they had machines all over the place.
Good racket.
Good racket.
Racket.
But they had lots of coups at the time, you know, in the West End. It was basically a licence to print money, and that's what they had.
You had the Bag of Nails Club there, the old man.
I think they had 10 at one time.
No, I know the Bag of Nails he had, because after he had it, the twins had it. I think every gangster in London at one time, the other had this club. They just used to hand it to each other, if you understand what I mean.
You've come from the war years and you've got nothing, you know. But every opportunity, if you've got a brain, is open to you. And this is what happened. Opportunists, a bit ruthless maybe, you know, I'm sure. But they could see ways of making money easily and living a lifestyle that they could have probably only once dreamed of.
Atlantic Machines had one-armed bandits in many of the major cities across the UK.
Frank and Eddie were regarded as hard men and would be allegedly into protection. They would tell you that they weren't protecting as such, but that they had been asked to be in a club to look after it. And you could quite see that if you went into a club with an idea to cause some trouble and you found Fraser or Richardson or worse, both of them sitting at the bar having a drink, you might think very carefully before you wanted to cause trouble that night.
If they needed to tell a few people off, as it were, I think they probably did. I think they were, you know, both of them, Eddie and Frank, were more than capable of looking after themselves. They, you know, they weren't scared of anybody. So, and fit men, and I think they were out to, you know, make a name for themselves.
But him and Eddie, they didn't go around punching people, which people think. They were businessmen, and they done it in a business way. But basically, what if you want to say the threat was the machine. That was the catalyst of it. The machine went in a business. That was it. That meant the machine.
But they were very hard.
Yes, of course it was. But in the clubs now, you know, if you go to any pub now or anything else, you get doormen. Well, that's all my father and Eddie were doing. They were putting doormen on clubs, which now is legal. Then, well, it weren't legal. Then you're demanding protection money.
But it was the protection of a South London nightclub that meant trouble for Frankie, Eddie and Atlantic Machines.
Some Manchester businessmen had run clubs in Manchester very profitably, and they wanted a London club. And they got this club over at Catford, which apparently was a perfectly nice little club. You could eat there, there was a bit of a cabaret. There was some troubles. Now, who was causing this, again, depends on who you believe. But Eddie Richardson and Frank Fraser were invited to look after the club.
An invitation in hindsight the pair should have refused.
They are there one night when a family called the Haywoods are there, and fighting breaks out late at night. And a man called Dickie Hart, who was a distant relation of the Crays, is shot dead.
What happened in Mr. Smith's is now stuff of legend. There are differing stories about Frankie's involvement that night.
He shot Dickie Hart. He got put down on the floor. He got a bullet in the leg, Fraser. And he picked the gun up and he shot Hart and killed him.
At the time, Frank's son David was 19 years old.
When he was in hospital at Lewisham, I actually went to see him, and he said to me, look, you know, he was surrounded by police guards and that. He said, David, the best thing for you, like, keep away. And actually he was right, because when I come out of the hospital, I was taken, put in a police car, taken to Catford and questioned over the murders.
Dickie Hart had been killed. Both Frankie and Eddie were shot and then arrested in hospital while being treated for their wounds. Frankie was charged with Hart's murder, but during the trial, the evidence was deemed insubstantial and he was sentenced to 5 years for a fray.
Mr. Smith's was the downfall of everyone, because after Mr. Smith's everything was very different. That was the end of the show, and it was a drunken row basically, and that ended it.
While the Mr. Smith's trial was underway, the police were gathering evidence on the activities of the Richardson Gang. Members of the gang were arrested and faced allegations of torture. Frankie Fraser was at the centre of it.
The Richardsons at that time had a reputation for beating up anyone who didn't pay them money that they thought they were owed. They were dealing in large sums of money, and they had the reputation for causing very serious damage to anybody who didn't pay on time or was giving the impression that they weren't going to pay.
You got to remember, this was all people that done Charlie some harm. You know, they overowed him money, didn't want to pay it back. It wasn't they just used to go and pull someone off the street and torture him.
According to the prosecution, and this would be denied by Fraser and always denied by Richardson, if somebody offended him, i.e. swindled him, Richardson, then the reprisals were extremely nasty. The story is that there was an electric box to which your gentles could be attached and the handle cranked. The allegation is that Frank pulled teeth out with a plier of one or two of the victims who had swindled Charlie Richardson.
I think a lot of it, the press went over the top with it. They was trying to get the Richardsons mainly as much porridge as they could give them.
In 1967, 42-year-old Frankie was sentenced to another 10 years inside, making a total of a 15-year stretch.
That's the game you was in. And if you're unlucky to get caught, if you're innocent or guilty, that's all in the game. And you just somehow live up to it and put your chin up in the air and just plead not guilty and fight them the best you can.
This is the story of Mad Frankie Fraser, the old London villain who's best known for his lethal reputation and lengthy prison sentences. By 1967, Frankie was looking at a 15-year stretch inside after the torture trial verdict. He was sent to Durham Prison, a familiar place. He'd been there before. He was well known in prisons across the country.
I'd seen him in Wandsworth. You know, you say, oh, you want to be careful with him, he's all right. Nah. Well, I just laughed. I said, there ain't two penneth of him. He's only little. And the screws were very, very frightened of him. Because, I mean, all right, he's only little, Frank, but he was so game, it was untrue.
He was well respected and well feared in prison. If he thought another prisoner was having a bad time from the screws, he would stand up against them, not necessarily to his own benefit.
During his time in prison, Frankie went through a number of punishments for his rebellious ways, from solitary confinement to the cat-o'-nine-tails. His most regular reprimand was bread and water.
Well, you must remember also, I've done more bread and water than any man alive. It's something you could never even dream about, especially when you're a young man with a terrific appetite And there you are on bread and water, day after day, night after night.
You got a cob in the morning and all the water you could drink. And you were starving. So they couldn't give you 28 days straight on bread and water. You done 1 day on bread and water, 1 day off. 1 day on, 1 day off.
For Frankie, his time inside meant war.
He was a man, and he was an hard man, and he could turn and switch off, literally switch off, you know, so he could not be blackmailed by kids or whatever, or family, to say, well, you've got to behave yourself, Fraser, otherwise you're never going to see him no more. He wouldn't have that at all. He went, no, I've got a mission to do, and that's my mission, etc. And he was one of those guys, he just couldn't swallow it. He wouldn't swallow it at all. You know, they started it, I'm going to finish it. Even though he couldn't win, he still fought his war.
I've seen it with my father, please believe me. We used to call it the war dance. My Frank and my Jimmy, I think the Indian blood in him, when he was losing his temper.
And I would never work in prison, ever. I was too lazy. Once I made a decision that I wouldn't work, I had to stick by it, and that was it.
So you're quite stubborn, really, aren't you?
Yes.
Tell me about it.
Yes, definitely.
One of the things with Frank is that if he said he would do something, he did it. Now, no matter at what cost to himself. So if he said, I am going to break your nose at 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, the fact he knew he was going to get a hammering from the prison officers, would go on bread and water, would lose his remission, would not stop him in any way. He would break your nose at 9 o'clock. It was a matter of pride. It was a matter of what I suppose he would regard it as a matter of honour.
For much of Frankie's time inside, he was classed as a dangerous prisoner. One way of dealing with him was to move him frequently from prison to prison.
I do know, when I was a baby in arms, I visited more prisons, I think, than most people's ever been in. When my mum used to go see my father, obviously she had no one to look after us. So I'd be a baby in arms and, you know, nice stories.
There's a story about when they used to move him from prison to prison, and he would be sitting in the back seat of a police car or whatever between 2 prison officers and handcuffed, and they'd be going through a town, and if a car drew up alongside them with a couple of young guys inside it, he would go, not yet, like that, as a way of winding up the prison officers.
In 1969, Frankie was transferred to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. It was home to some of the most notorious criminals in the UK.
I was in Chelmsford and I was tooled up with a guy, and he'd just been transferred from Parkhurst. And he went, oh, you're just going on, what a horrible place, terrible, brutal, the beltings that they were giving out there. He said there'd be a riot there or whatever. I went, they've just moved my dad there, Tony, when it'd go off now.
I had 4 days to do, and Frank came up to me, he said, we're going to have a riot tomorrow. I said, are you really? Well, have it on your own, because I'm going out 4 days. Don't involve me. And sure enough, 3 days after I got out, they had a riot in Parkhurst.
I think somebody had escaped from Parkhurst, and the other prisoners mocked the prison staff for this and were winding them up, and this led to a kind of final explosion of violence, and a lot of prison officers being beaten up and a lot of prisoners being beaten up.
It was the food, the conditions of the screws, the way they was treating people, you know, a lot of things that was happening that shouldn't have been happening.
By the standards of an American prison riot, it was really a sort of little scuffle. But I mean, there's no doubt billiard balls were thrown hard at the warders. Fighting broke out, and Fraser was really in quite a bad way by the end of it.
I think Frank G'd everybody up to them riots because he was good at getting people at it. Behind every bit of trouble in prison, you'd find Frank.
Frankie's sister Eva hired lawyer James Morton to represent him.
The prison officers would try and wind me up. They would say, oh, he's in a very bad mood today. You sit with your back to the door and we'll try to get to him before he gets you. Or we've put you in the doctor's room today. There's a bell under the table, so when he comes at you, not if, when he comes at you, press the bell and we'll burst in the room. But I never had the slightest bit of trouble with him. He was as polite as he was when I met him 30 years later.
Then they did literally try to kill him there. They broke both his legs. It was terrible. The nearest, I think, in all the jail years he was away, to come in to kill him. And if it weren't for Aunt Eva, they would have killed him. Eva kept him alive, because she made sure there was publicity. She pestered him.
As a result of his participation in the riot, Frankie had 5 years added to his 15-year sentence. In 1989, Frankie was free from prison for the last time. He kept his head down for the next couple of years, but in 1991 made the headlines again. He was shot outside of Turnmills nightclub in Clerkenwell.
I was home at the time and they missed. It was basically, but we allowed people to believe that they hit him. Well, you've seen him, can you see any scars on his face? It's nonsense, and it was, in his case, it was nonsense. They missed. He chased a guy, whoever it was, up the road.
I think he said my father was Tutankhamun who done it.
Well, that's what the press
I think that's what his words were, it was Tutankhamun.
You know, you win some and you lose some, and in our world, you've got to expect, if you played by the sword, you've got to expect the sword as well.
As he spent more time on the outside, Frankie started making the most of his gangster reputation with the media.
It probably comes to everybody's sort of time in life where you decide, you know, maybe you're bored. Maybe he's bored with going to prison. He didn't want to go anymore. He got fed up with it, you know. When he was young, it was okay. And Charlie often used to say to him, you know, it's negative. It's all negative. Why don't you, you know, try and do something? You've got some interesting stories to tell. Very often when people would phone up and ask Charlie for articles or would he go on a television programme, he would say, go and see Frank. Frank's got, you know, far more exciting ones than I have.
Frank was a public face. I mean, there's no doubt he put himself about after he came out and he did his books. He did a cabaret act in the West End and down the East End when he told stories and someone played the piano a bit. He was forever on television. I think he was in a television commercial. He put himself about and made himself or reinvented himself as a minor celebrity.
Frankie is now retired and living in South London. He's still causing a stir though. Last year, he even picked up an ASBO for arguing with another man in his residential accommodation.
He's very happy with his life, with my father. You know, he's settled, he's getting older now, he's getting more sentimental, more a large family around him, I think 13 great-grandchildren.
He's very pragmatic about death as well, Pat, isn't he? He seems to be...
I don't really talk about it, to be honest with you. I'll have larks with him and go, yeah, you're getting old now, but I don't think he sees it. Sometimes he say, oh, well, you know, you've got to understand I'm getting old now, but not too often.
Why do you think you got caught so many times?
Because I was a bad thief. I wasn't a very good one. I kept getting caught.
I think Frank would never admit publicly any regrets. And so when you ask him, do you regret something? He says, yes, I regret I didn't steal the crown jewels. He is sort of hiding something, and that would be that he did spend so long in prison.
I've asked him this question a million times about the 20 years and that. Would you ever change it, Dad? You could go back? No. Other than getting caught, obviously, but no. So no, I wouldn't have done my life any other way.
That's how he is, and he's not going to change.
Overall, Frankie spent more than 42 years in prison for 26 offences.
For his time in prison, apart from anything else, you have to put Fraser absolutely in the top drawer of criminals. Also, apart from anything else, he was there in what you would call the heyday of the London gang, from the Sabinis onwards, the Crays, the Richardsons. He was there at the time, so you have to say, without doubt, he is a seminal figure.
No, I would never give in, definitely. I'd fight until they knocked me unconscious or whatever. That's how it was.